It was a bright afternoon when Officer Williams noticed him. Walking down the quiet streets of a mostly peaceful, small town, the man caught the officer's attention. Dressed in civilian clothes, with a confident yet calm stride, he didn't look like he belonged. Officer Williams had patrolled this area for years, and he had never seen someone like this before. He felt an odd sense of suspicion rise in him, despite not knowing why. The man was black, and the neighborhood was mostly white, so that alone seemed to make Officer Williams uneasy. Without giving it much thought, he decided to stop him. He thought maybe the man was lost or acting out of place, but in reality, the officer's judgment was already clouded. He didn't even think twice about approaching the man. "Hey, stop right there," Officer Williams called out, walking toward him. The man turned, looking calm but slightly surprised. "Can I help you, officer?" Officer Williams stood in front of him. "I need to ask you a few questions," he said, his voice blunt. "What are you doing here? This isn't your usual neighborhood." The man looked at the officer with a steady gaze. "I'm just walking home. I live here," he said calmly. Officer Williams didn't believe him right away. "You live here?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge. He stared at the man, sizing him up. There was something about his confidence, the way he spoke, that seemed to make the officer more suspicious. "I'm just trying to get to my car," the man replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not doing anything wrong." But Officer Williams didn't seem convinced. He was trained to look for signs of suspicious behavior, and in his mind, this man didn't fit. He didn't think twice about the fact that the man had been polite and cooperative from the start. Instead, his mind raced with assumptions, and his biases took over. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Officer Williams said, his tone commanding. The man sighed quietly, but reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet. He handed over his ID without protest, but his expression had changed. The calmness in his face remained, but there was a hint of frustration beneath it. It wasn't because he had done anything wrong, but because he could feel the officer's suspicion based solely on the way he looked. Officer Williams took the ID and glanced at it. The name read General Thomas Anderson. It was then that the officer paused. The name seemed vaguely familiar. Still, he didn't let it show on his face. He took a closer look and saw that the man was indeed someone important, someone with a long list of accomplishments. But Officer Williams didn't let that information influence his actions yet. "I still need to ask you a few questions," Officer Williams continued, trying to justify his actions. He wasn't ready to let go of the suspicion that had taken hold of him. The man, General Anderson, looked directly at Officer Williams. "I'm a general in the Army," he said calmly, but his voice was beginning to carry more weight. "I've been serving my country for years. You're making a mistake." But the officer didn't listen. His mind had already made a decision. He had already decided that the man in front of him was guilty of something, though he couldn't say exactly what. With a sigh, General Anderson stood still, trying to remain composed, knowing that the situation could easily escalate. General Thomas Anderson stood still, trying to keep his composure. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the tension in the air made him nervous. Officer Williams was still holding on to his suspicion, not willing to let go. His mind was already set on questioning the general, even though he had been cooperative. "I've told you who I am," General Anderson said, his voice steady. "I'm not the person you're looking for." But Officer Williams didn't seem to hear him. He had already made up his mind. "I'm going to have to arrest you," the officer said firmly, his voice almost harsh. General Anderson's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never been in this situation before. As an Army general, he had traveled the world, faced many dangerous situations, and yet never once had he been arrested like this. He had earned respect, not just from the military, but from his country. He had never been treated like a criminal, especially not in his own town. "What are you talking about? Arrest me?" General Anderson asked, trying to stay calm. "I'm telling you, I'm an Army general." Officer Williams didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his hand resting on the handcuffs of his belt. General Anderson could feel his frustration growing. He was being treated like a criminal, like someone who was dangerous, simply because of his appearance. The officer's actions were based on nothing but assumption, and it felt like a punch to the gut. "Sir, please step over here," Officer Williams ordered, trying to guide the general toward his patrol car. "I don't need to go anywhere," General Anderson replied, his voice still calm but firm. "You don't have the right to arrest me. I haven't done anything wrong." But Officer Williams ignored him. "I'm just doing my job. You're being arrested for suspicion. That's all there is to it." General Anderson couldn't understand why this was happening. He had spent years in service to his country, always following the rules, earning his place. Yet here he was, being treated like an enemy. His mind raced, but he refused to show any signs of fear. He wasn't going to make this worse by losing his cool. He stayed silent, hoping that Officer Williams would realize his mistake. The officer walked behind him, and within moments, the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. General Anderson didn't resist. He knew that would only make the situation worse. Officer Williams didn't look at him. His attention focused on the task. He opened the door to the patrol car, ready to push General Anderson inside. As he did, General Anderson took a deep breath. He had been through many tough situations in his life, but none of them had ever made him feel as small as this one. The officer's actions were unjust, but he remained composed, refusing to let his pride or anger get in the way. The door slammed shut, and the patrol car started to drive away. General Anderson sat quietly in the back, trying to figure out how this had gone so wrong. He wasn't just frustrated by the arrest. He was disappointed. Disappointed that someone in a position of power had made such a careless decision based on nothing but assumptions. As the car made its way toward the police station, the officer's thoughts were starting to change. The truth about who General Anderson was starting to settle in his mind, but the damage had already been done. The patrol car hummed steadily as it made its way toward the police station. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Williams kept his eyes on the road, his mind still swirling with the decision he had made. He had arrested a man he didn't know, based on nothing but his own suspicions. The thought kept nagging at him, but he pushed it away. He was just doing his job. Right. General Anderson sat in the back of the car, his arms resting in the cold, tight handcuffs. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He just looked out the window, watching the streets pass by. There was nothing more he could say. The officer had made up his mind, and there was no turning back. Still, the feeling of being treated unfairly gnawed at him. He had served his country, earned his position, and this was how he was treated. When they arrived at the station, Officer Williams opened the door of the car, motioning for General Anderson to step out. The officer was still focused, his mind set on the procedure. He wasn't thinking about who the man was or the situation he had caused. He simply needed to process this arrest. But as they entered the station, something strange happened. Officer Williams handed over General Anderson's ID to the desk sergeant, his hand slightly trembling as the weight of the situation began to settle on him. The sergeant glanced at the ID and then did a double take. His eyes widened as he saw the name. General Thomas Anderson. "Wait a minute," the sergeant said, looking up at Officer Williams with confusion. "This guy's a general in the Army, right?" Officer Williams nodded, not fully understanding the depth of what was happening. He had already made the arrest and followed procedure without a second thought. But now, as he looked at the name on the ID, a sinking feeling grew in his stomach. Something wasn't right. I didn't know," Officer Williams stammered. He was acting suspicious. "I thought." "You thought?" The sergeant interrupted, his tone sharp. "This is General Thomas Anderson. He's a high-ranking officer in the military. He's been awarded medals for his service. Are you telling me you arrested him without checking who he was?" Officer Williams froze. His chest tightened as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had arrested a respected army general, someone who had served his country with honor, for no reason other than a bias he had failed to recognize. His face flushed with embarrassment, and he struggled to find the right words. I didn't know," he said quietly. He had no excuse. There was no way to justify what he had done. The sergeant looked at him sternly, disappointed. "You've made a serious mistake. This isn't just a case of misjudging someone. You've let your assumptions cloud your judgment, and now we're going to have to deal with the consequences." Officer Williams felt like he was sinking into the floor. He wanted to explain, to make it right somehow, but there was nothing he could say. The truth was undeniable. He had acted on his biases, and now he had to face it. General Anderson stood silently, watching the exchange. He hadn't said anything because he was waiting for the officer to realize his mistake. The general wasn't angry, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. He had hoped for better, for fair treatment, but instead he had been treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. As the situation unfolded, Officer Williams knew he had made a terrible error in judgment. He had no idea how he was going to fix this, but he knew he had to try. The room was silent as Officer Williams stood, feeling the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. General Anderson had been released into the hands of his commanding officer, and now Officer Williams was left to face the consequences of his actions. He could hardly believe what had just happened. A simple misunderstanding had spiraled into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. Officer Williams sat in his office, his hands resting on his desk. He couldn't stop thinking about the look in General Anderson's eyes. The general hadn't raised his voice or even gotten angry. He had simply stayed calm, showing a quiet strength that only made Officer Williams feel worse. He was a man who had earned the respect of his country. Yet here he was, wrongly accused and treated like a criminal. The phone on Officer Williams' desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He took a deep breath and picked it up, knowing what was coming next. "Officer Williams, it's the commanding officer of General Anderson," the voice on the other end said, sharp and formal. "I need to speak with you. I've been informed of the situation." Officer Williams' stomach tightened. "Yes, sir. I'm very sorry about what happened. I made a huge mistake, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right." There was a long pause before the voice replied, "Meet me at the station. We need to discuss this in person." Officer Williams hung up the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the conversation ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. He had to face the consequences of his actions and take responsibility for what he had done. No excuses, no more running from the truth. When Officer Williams arrived at the station, he was directed to a small conference room. The walls were bare, the air thick with tension. He sat down at the table, his palms sweaty, and waited for General Anderson's commanding officer to arrive. The door opened, and a tall, serious man in full military uniform walked in. He didn't say anything at first, but just stared at Officer Williams, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You made a serious mistake today, officer," the commanding officer said. "You arrested a decorated army general, someone who has served this country with honor. And you did it without reason." "I know, sir," Officer Williams replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I acted without thinking. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." The commanding officer took a seat across from him, his eyes hard. "Why did you arrest him, officer? What made you decide to treat him like a criminal?" "I don't know," Officer Williams admitted, his voice filled with regret. "I saw him walking through the neighborhood, and I made an assumption. I thought he didn't belong there. I let my biases take control, and I didn't take the time to really look at who he was." The commanding officer's face softened slightly, but his tone remained serious. "And now you realize the damage you've done. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of deeper issues that need to be addressed. What are you going to do about it?" Officer Williams lowered his head. "I know I failed, but I want to learn. I want to change. I can't undo what I've done, but I can make sure it never happens again. The commanding officer leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. This isn't just about saying sorry, officer. It's about taking action. It's about understanding that we all have a responsibility to fight against our biases and work toward a fairer world. General Anderson deserves an apology, yes, but you also owe it to yourself and to everyone else you serve to do better. I understand, sir, Officer Williams said, nodding slowly. And I'm ready to start. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. The commanding officer stood up and gave him a long, hard look before speaking again. Good. You've got a long road ahead, officer, but it starts with one step. Take responsibility, learn from this, and show everyone that you can change. As Officer Williams left the meeting, he felt a mix of shame and determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a much longer journey, but he was ready to start. He had made a mistake, but he wouldn't let it define him. He was going to learn, grow, and make sure that this never happened again. The real work had only just begun. The next day, Officer Williams stood outside the police station, his stomach in knots. He had never been so nervous in his life. Today, he would have to face General Thomas Anderson again, and this time, it wouldn't be to arrest him. It would be to apologize. The general had already been released, but Officer Williams knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to make up for his mistake. He had treated the general unfairly, based on assumptions that had no place in law enforcement. Now, he needed to make things right. As he walked into the station, Officer Williams saw General Anderson standing near the front desk, talking to the desk sergeant. The moment their eyes met, the officer's heart raced. The general's calm expression didn't reveal any anger, but Officer Williams knew there was disappointment in those eyes. General Anderson, Officer Williams said, his voice hesitant but sincere. I need to apologize for what happened yesterday. I made a terrible mistake. The general turned to face him, his posture relaxed but alert. You're the officer who arrested me, right? His voice was calm, but there was a trace of firmness that made Officer Williams feel the weight of his actions. Yes, sir, Officer Williams replied, lowering his head. I've been thinking a lot about it. I acted out of suspicion, without taking the time to understand who you were. I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you. General Anderson studied the officer for a moment, his eyes searching for sincerity. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. I appreciate your apology, officer, but it's not just about saying sorry. It's about understanding why it happened in the first place. Officer Williams nodded slowly. I understand. I made a judgment based on nothing but my biases, and I should have known better. No one deserves to be treated like that. The general's expression softened slightly. We all have biases. It's how we deal with them that matters. But you're right. The real problem is not what happened yesterday. It's what led to it. Officer Williams swallowed hard. He had never thought of it that way. He had always prided himself on doing his job fairly, but now he realized that his own views had been clouded by prejudice. It wasn't just about making a mistake. It was about the deeper issue of how those biases had influenced his actions. I'll do better, Officer Williams said, his voice filled with determination. I'll take responsibility for what I did, and I'll work to change. I want to learn, General. I want to be a better officer. General Anderson looked at him thoughtfully. The first step is recognizing your mistake, but the work doesn't end there. You have to actively fight against those biases every day. And that takes more than just saying the right words. I know, Officer Williams replied, his shoulders slumping slightly. It's going to take time, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to change. The general nodded, his expression serious but not unkind. You're on the right path, officer. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. As long as you keep working to improve, you'll get there. There was a long pause, and then General Anderson extended his hand. Officer Williams hesitated for a moment, then took it firmly. "I won't forget this," the general said. "But I believe in second chances. I hope you'll make the most of yours." As the two men shook hands, Officer Williams felt a sense of relief. He knew that he could never undo what had happened, but at least now, he was taking the first step toward making things right. He had learned something important, not just about himself, but about the world around him. The journey ahead would not be easy, but Officer Williams was ready to face it. With General Anderson's words in his mind, he knew that the road to change was one he could walk with conviction. The first step had been taken. Now, it was time to keep moving forward. The days after his meeting with General Anderson were not easy for Officer Williams. Each morning, he woke up knowing that he had made a serious mistake, and each day, he tried to learn from it. But no matter how hard he worked to make things right, the weight of his actions stayed with him. It wasn't enough to just say sorry. He had to prove he was truly committed to changing. Officer Williams spent the next few days reading, learning about unconscious bias, racism, and how it affects people's lives. He attended meetings with his department about diversity and inclusion. But even as he tried to do better, he felt like he was fighting an uphill battle. He could never fully erase what had happened, and that was what hurt the most. He had treated a man with respect and honor as a criminal, simply because of his own biases. He couldn't undo that, but he could learn from it and change. That, he believed, was the only way forward. He spent hours reflecting on his past decisions. His training as a police officer had always focused on rules and procedures, but the true challenge was understanding the human side of his job. Officer Williams realized that he had been too focused on following rules and not enough on understanding the people he was supposed to protect and serve. One afternoon, after a particularly tough meeting with his colleagues, Officer Williams sat in his car, feeling exhausted. He couldn't shake the thought of how badly he had handled things. He had arrested General Anderson, someone who had dedicated his life to serving the country, for no reason other than his own assumptions. The general had not fought back or raised his voice, and that only made it worse. It showed Officer Williams how deeply his own views had been flawed. "I can't just forget about this," Officer Williams muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel. "I have to make it right. Somehow." He thought about the general's calm words during their meeting, about the chance he had been given to change. Officer Williams knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about doing his part to make the world a better place for everyone. He had learned that, in order to be a better officer, he had to first be a better person. That evening, Officer Williams made a decision. He would reach out to General Anderson again. This time, it wouldn't just be to apologize. It would be to ask for help. The general had shown him kindness and patience, and now Officer Williams needed to learn how to do the same for others. He knew he had a lot of work to do, but he was ready to take the next step. The next morning, he picked up the phone and called General Anderson's office. It rang a few times before someone answered. After explaining who he was, Officer Williams was put on hold for a few moments. His heart raced. What if the general didn't want to hear from him again? What if he was angry about the whole situation? Finally, General Anderson's voice came through the phone. "Officer Williams," the general said, his tone calm. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. What's on your mind?" Officer Williams hesitated for a moment. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. I want to do better. I want to understand more, and I was hoping you could help me." There was a long pause, and then General Anderson spoke again, his voice steady. "It takes a lot of courage to admit that, officer. I'll be happy to help you. Let's talk." For the first time in a long while, Officer Williams felt like he was on the right path. The struggle wasn't over, but he had finally taken a step in the right direction. With the general's guidance, he hoped to change not just his own life, but the way he served his community. The road ahead would be difficult, but Officer Williams was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The phone call with General Anderson marked a new chapter for Officer Williams. It was the first step toward truly understanding the changes he needed to make. He had spent days reflecting on his mistakes, but now he was ready to do something more than just feel sorry for himself. He wanted to learn, to grow, and to use his position to help others understand the importance of fairness and respect. A few days after their conversation, General Anderson invited Officer Williams to meet him in person. The meeting was scheduled at a community center, a place where both police officers and local residents came together to talk about important issues. General Anderson had suggested it as a neutral ground where they could discuss the path forward. Officer Williams arrived early, feeling nervous but also determined. He had never been so committed to personal growth before, but the gravity of his actions had made him realize just how important this was. He didn't want to just be a better officer. He wanted to be a better human being. When General Anderson walked into the room, his presence was calm yet commanding. The general greeted Officer Williams with a firm handshake, his eyes filled with understanding. "Thank you for meeting with me, General," Officer Williams said, his voice sincere. "I'm glad you reached out, Officer Williams," General Anderson replied. "It's not easy to confront our mistakes, but it's the first step to change. Now let's talk about how we can move forward." They sat down at a table, and General Anderson began to explain some of the key lessons he had learned throughout his life. He shared his experiences, both in the military and in the community, emphasizing how important it was to recognize biases and address them head-on. "You see, officer," General Anderson said, "we all have biases. They're a part of being human. But what matters is how we respond to them. When we let our biases control our actions, we harm others. But when we acknowledge them and work to change, we become part of the solution." Officer Williams listened carefully, taking in every word. He had never really thought about bias in this way. It wasn't just about what he had done wrong. It was about recognizing the patterns in his thinking and actively working to break them. "I understand now," Officer Williams said, his voice soft but filled with realization. "I can't just acknowledge my bias and hope it goes away. I need to actively work on changing the way I think and the way I treat others." General Anderson nodded. "Exactly. It's a lifelong journey. It's not something that happens overnight, but every step counts. It's about being conscious of how our actions affect others and striving to do better every day." The conversation moved forward, and Officer Williams began to understand just how much work he had ahead of him. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, he felt hopeful. This was the path to redemption, a path that would require hard work, but one that was worth every step. As they talked, General Anderson offered practical advice for how Officer Williams could continue learning and growing. He encouraged him to attend diversity and inclusion workshops, engage with different communities, and take responsibility for his actions. He also suggested that Officer Williams share his experience with others so they could learn from his mistakes and avoid making the same ones. By the end of their meeting, Officer Williams felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had taken a significant step toward making things right, and he knew that he couldn't stop there. The real work had only just begun. As he left the community center that day, Officer Williams felt more determined than ever. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. He had taken responsibility for his past actions, and now he was going to build a better future, not just for himself, but for everyone he served. The weeks that followed Officer Williams' meeting with General Anderson were not easy. Every day, he had to confront the biases and assumptions that had been a part of his thinking for years. He attended diversity training workshops, read books, and engaged in conversations with people from different backgrounds. At first, it felt like a challenge, something he had to force himself to do. But as time went on, Officer Williams began to realize just how much he was learning. Every morning, he reminded himself of the lessons he was absorbing. He kept a journal to track his progress, writing down his thoughts, the things he learned, and the ways he was trying to change. Sometimes, he would revisit his earlier reflections, reading through them and realizing how much his perspective had shifted. One of the most eye-opening moments for Officer Williams came when he had a conversation with a young resident from a local neighborhood. She had grown up in an area that often felt ignored by the police, and when Officer Williams spoke to her, he could see the hesitance in her eyes. She didn't trust the police, and Officer Williams understood why. He had been a part of a system that, whether he intended it or not, had made people like her feel unsafe. "I know I can't change everything," Officer Williams had told her, "but I want you to know that I'm working to do better. I'm here to listen, to help, and to make sure that everyone is treated fairly." Her response was cautious, but it was also hopeful. "I've never heard an officer say that before," she said, "but I hope you mean it." That conversation stuck with Officer Williams. It made him realize that the road to regaining trust wasn't going to be quick or easy, but it was possible. Every day was a chance to prove that he was committed to being part of the solution, not part of the problem. He also kept in touch with General Anderson. After their first conversation, the general had continued to offer support and guidance. General Anderson invited him to community events, where officers and local residents could meet and talk openly about their concerns. These events gave Officer Williams a chance to see how important it was for the police to connect with the people they served in a meaningful way. One evening, Officer Williams found himself at another community meeting, sitting next to a group of young people who were skeptical of the police. They asked him difficult questions about his past actions and the changes he was making. It wasn't always easy to answer, but Officer Williams knew that facing the truth was the only way forward. "I made mistakes," he admitted to them, "but I'm learning. I'm here because I want to understand you, to understand your concerns, and I want to show you that I'm here to protect and serve, not to judge or harm." Over time, Officer Williams began to feel a shift within himself. His old habits of rushing to judgment were slowly being replaced by a more thoughtful, open-minded approach. He no longer saw the people he served as problems to be solved, but as individuals with stories and experiences that mattered. One day, as he walked through the streets of the same neighborhood where he had once wrongly arrested General Anderson, Officer Williams saw a young woman walking toward him. She stopped in front of him, and for a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other. "You're the officer, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes, I am," Officer Williams replied, a bit nervous. She smiled, her eyes filled with a kind of quiet understanding. "I heard about what happened. I know it wasn't easy for you, but I think you're doing the right thing now." That small moment, that simple exchange, meant more to Officer Williams than any apology he could have made. It was proof that he was on the right path, and that change, though slow, was happening. As Officer Williams continued to walk through the neighborhood, he realized how much his journey had shaped him. He had started this process as a man who had made a mistake, but now he was becoming someone who was actively working to improve. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Officer Williams truly believed he could make a difference. Months had passed since Officer Williams began his journey of change. The guilt from his earlier actions still lingered, but each day he grew more confident in the steps he was taking to improve. His daily routine had changed. He was no longer just a police officer going through the motions. He had become a part of the community, listening, learning, and working hard to rebuild trust. Officer Williams had made it a point to attend as many community meetings as he could, engaging with people, learning from their experiences, and sharing what he had learned about his own mistakes. Slowly, the people who had once been hesitant began to see him not as a symbol of their fear, but as someone who was genuinely trying to make things better. And it wasn't just the residents who were noticing. His fellow officers began to see the change in him too. One day, Officer Williams was assigned to a new role. It was a small assignment compared to his earlier days, but it felt significant. He was tasked with working closely with a group of officers on a community outreach program. The goal was to teach new recruits the importance of understanding biases and how to treat people with respect, regardless of their background. At first, the new recruits were skeptical. They were used to seeing things through a narrow lens, taught that they needed to enforce the law at all costs. But Officer Williams had learned from his own mistakes, and he knew that teaching them was just as important as his own personal growth. I know many of you have been taught that the job is about rules and enforcement, he began during one of their first meetings. But let me tell you something I learned the hard way. It's also about people. It's about understanding who you're serving. And you can't do that if you're blinded by your own biases. As Officer Williams spoke, he could see the recruits listening more closely. Some of them nodded, as if they were beginning to understand what he was saying. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy for them, but he was determined to help them start on the right path. Later that week, he met General Anderson again. The general had been involved in several community initiatives, and Officer Williams had joined one of the meetings where they discussed how the police and military could work together to improve their relationship with the community. This time, their conversation was different, more open, more collaborative. Officer Williams, General Anderson said with a smile, "I'm proud of the progress you've made. I can see that you're doing the work, and that matters more than anything else." The words felt like a validation of everything Officer Williams had been trying to accomplish. General Anderson had seen the effort he was putting in, and it meant the world to him. It wasn't just about the apology anymore. It was about the work they had both done together to improve their communities. One evening, as Officer Williams was walking back to his car after a long shift, he passed by a small group of people talking outside a local cafe. One of them stopped and smiled when they saw him. "You're that officer, right?" the person asked. "The one who made things right. I've been hearing good things about you." Officer Williams smiled, humbled by the compliment. "I'm just doing my job," he said. "But thank you. I'm trying to make a difference." The person nodded and gave him a thumbs up before walking away. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot to Officer Williams. It was proof that his efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. As he got into his car, he looked back at the group, feeling a sense of pride in what he had accomplished. There was still much work to be done. But Officer Williams was no longer just a man who had made a mistake. He was someone who was actively working to change the system, to help others understand the importance of fairness, respect, and compassion. He started the engine, ready for the next day, knowing that his journey was far from over. But for the first time, he truly believed in the change he was working toward. And that belief made all the difference.